Trinidad and Tobago economy and energy perspective. Guys, as soon as we advertise this program, we've been flooded with questions. So we have a lot of questions for Kevin tonight. I don't know how much we'll be able to get through, but just looking at the questions and seeing the areas of interest that captured our audience. Questions came in on what does the oil and gas prices being lower than the budgeted prices mean for Trinidad and Tobago? How many oil and gas reserves do we have left, and what is our plan for new reserves? Kevin's thoughts on the Dragon Gas deal, government policy and how it affects foreign investment, the rise of the sleeping giant Guyana and what that means for Trinidad and Tobago. And we also had questions on electric vehicles and clean forms of energy, right? So we will see how much of those questions we could get into tonight after Kevin's presentation. We may have to have a part 2 once Kevin agrees. So we'll see how it goes tonight. So on that note, I would like to say a very special welcome to Mr. Kevin Ramnarine. A special welcome to you, our viewers who have joined us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, and those who will watch the show after. Welcome to the members of the media who will be joining us, and also to the members of the Compass Foundation. And last but not least, I have to hail out my 2 co-moderators, the Compass Bureau, Chris Hussain, and former councillor and HSC officer, Mr. Sarfraz Ali. As usual, we are looking to wrap up between 9 and 9:30. We tend to make a hard stop around 9:30. So without further ado, I would like to pass you on to Mr. Kevin Ramnarine.
Hi, good night, Ms. Dure. And as you mentioned, Lisha and I go back over 30 years, back to the days of natural sciences in UWI. I did chemistry as my first degree, and she was doing computer science and mathematics. So we go back a long way. Sarfraz is somebody I know before politics. At one point in time, I was Sarfraz's demonstrator in the chemistry labs in UWI. So, and Chris, I've campaigned with you in 2020 with Sean Sobers. So thanks for having me. And it's interesting times that we live in, because the world is in a state
Kevin,
of...
I just want to say, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say, you are very good, thorough, friendly demonstrator. So thank you very much for helping me get my degree in chemistry. Thank you, Kevin.
No problem, thanks. So tonight we just want to look at where's the economy, because what we are hearing from the people in authority, what we're hearing from the Minister of Finance, and what we're hearing from some of the chambers of commerce doesn't seem to be reflected on the ground. If you listen to people speak about the economy, people from the government, of course, they would try to paint a nice picture of the economy. But we are on the ground, and we're talking to people, and we know that things are on the ground. And somebody sent me a text message saying that they counted something like 40% of the stores in Trin-City Mall are now closed. Store spaces. Lisha, you might go to Trin-City Mall more than I go to Trin-City Mall, right? So we're not seeing that dynamism reflected on the ground in Trinidad. We've come out of the pandemic. Most countries have now put the pandemic behind them, but our rebound from the pandemic has been sort of lethargic. We had 2% growth, well, we don't have the official figures for 2022 yet. We'll probably get that in, way down in September, and that's one of the challenges we have with this country, which is data. But we expect that we would have gotten 2% growth in 2022. I think the growth was negative in 2021, which was the first full year really out of the pandemic. So let me just share some starting thoughts with you all. In thinking about what we're going to talk about today, it dawned upon me that this year is the 50th year of the beginning of the first oil boom. And the first oil boom really started in late 1973, when there was a war in the Middle East that caused the price of oil to quadruple. And at the time the price of oil was quadrupling in between 1973 and 1974, the production of oil in Trinidad and Tobago was beginning to ramp up significantly, because Amoco, a name that some of the older people would be familiar with, was beginning to bring new oil fields into production. So Trinidad entered that period of fantastic economic expansion between 1973 and 1981, thereabouts. We call that the oil boom, right? Then there was a second period of, I don't like to call it a boom, right? Because when you use the term boom, that comes with certain expectations. There was a second period of rapid economic growth, and that was somewhere between 1999 and 2008, around it. It ended when there was the crash of the world economy in 2008 because of the subprime mortgage crisis in the US. So those are two periods of rapid economic expansion. And the first one, as I said, started 50 years ago. So if we were to look at some of, let me now share some of my slides. And you all tell me if you see in the slides, right?
Yes, we are.
Yes.
So no discussion on the state of the economy could happen or should happen without talking about crime, because it is incontrovertible that crime is a deterrent to investment. I'm sure many of you all would have had conversations with business people who have expressed a reluctance to expand their business. Businessmen have been targets of course, criminal activity, and that would deter their appetite for further investment in Trinidad and Tobago. So when we look at murders here would be the orange line. You see the trend with murders. In the year 2000, which was just 23 years ago, I mean, most of us here, Safraz was certainly alive, Alicia was certainly alive, I was certainly alive. Rushton, who has joined us, MP Rushton Parry, would have remembered the year 2000. We had about 110 murders in the year 2000. And that has now gone to 600 murders. And that must have a bearing on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. So I thought that we should not forget to talk about crime when we talk about the economy. So we are now, I think the figure that I got was 607 murders for 2022. And, you know, it is nothing to be proud about, but it looks like we are on target to reach the 600 figure again in 2023. And Dr. Roger Hussein, now Professor Roger Hussein, has done some what he calls what they call auto-regressive moving average, right? Lisha would have done mathematics in UE. The acronym for that is ARIMA, right? And it shows that the trend with murders would continue, right? So unfortunately, that is having a serious impact on the economy. The blue line in the graph is our real GDP. And real GDP simply means gross domestic product, or the value of goods and services produced in the economy, adjusted for inflation, in this case, using what we call 2012 prices. So this is a pretty large data set we have here. And we could see as the economy grew in the early 2000s, so too did crime. You all see that trend here. And then there was a bit of decoupling in the UNC period where the economy grew and crime sort of, it wasn't acceptable, but it had sort of fallen away, and murders were in the 400s around there, generally in the UNC period. And then, of course, we have the post-pandemic period. And you see this sudden spike taking place in murders, while at the same time, the economy remains pretty lethargic. As you see, a little bit of growth there in 2022, but huge growth in murders. So we have a situation where crime in Trinidad and Tobago is running away, 600 murders plus for a small country like Trinidad and Tobago could never be acceptable. While at the same time, the population is facing the crisis of crime. The population is also facing an economy which is lackluster. And no matter what people in government say, I think the consensus is that the economy is lackluster. And we'll go into the reasons for that in a bit, right? If you look at this graph, now, what is the importance of natural gas to this entire story? And this is a pretty complicated graph, but what it's called an XY scatter plot. And this graph was borrowed from Dr. Roger Hussein a few minutes ago. And what this graph shows is that there is a high correlation between the health of our economy and the production of natural gas. And a correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. And this graph is saying the correlation between natural gas production and the economy of Trinidad and Tobago is 0.92. So natural gas production is literally the heartbeat and the pulse of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And when that begins to fall off, then we are facing difficulty in Trinidad and Tobago. This graph shows what has happened to natural gas production over the last 20 years. And, you know, the graph, when you look at it, it might look like the outline of an elephant, right? You can see the head and the body and the tail and so on. But this graph shows that in 2021, and I highlighted 2 numbers here on this graph. The highest number on the graph is 4330, which is our highest production in the last 20 years. That happened in 2010. And our lowest production on this graph is 25979, which is in the year 2021. And the units would be millions of cubic feet of gas per day. So it shows that really and truly, from 2015 to the present day, natural gas production has been in significant decline. All right, so I wouldn't be political. I would say that during our period when we were in government, there was decline taking place, but the decline has been a lot more pronounced, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. And that has been having a significant bearing on the country's economy. And you all mentioned the prices that the budget was based on. But the budget is based on 2 prices. One is an oil price of $92.50 per barrel, and the other one is a gas price of $6 per MMBTU. Certainly the minister of, and based on those 2 prices, the minister expected, and when I say the minister, I mean Colin Imbert, the minister expected, I think somebody is trying to join, the minister expected a revenue of 56.18 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Now, the minister used the highest oil price assumption ever, and he used the highest gas price assumption ever. And he's still expecting to collect $56.18 billion. That is not the highest revenue this country has ever collected. The highest revenue the country ever collected was in 2014, what I should know, right? And that was 58.4 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. And we were not using oil price and gas price assumptions anywhere close to what the minister was using. So the question logically is, if the minister is using the highest ever assumptions, then why is he not collecting more revenue than the country collected in 2014? We still not, if you're using the highest ever price assumptions, you should be collecting revenue in the region of $60+ billion. And the answer is production. Because, you know, the issue is that we're not producing the volumes of natural gas as this graph shows, and the volumes of oil that would have allowed us to maximize or to capitalize on the opportunity presented by the Russia-Ukraine war, which is now going into its 2nd year. And the interesting thing is that the world's energy markets seem to have gotten over that war, meaning that gas prices in Europe have come down by 64% since the minister read the budget. Significant fall in gas prices in Europe. And we'll talk a bit about why that is so. But those things affect us. So natural gas production is the main bugbear for the country's economy, and the main reason why the economy is in this state that we are in, this state of low growth or no growth. In looking a bit again at natural gas production, these are what we call waterfall charts. And the blue bars, the first blue bar would be the production in the year 2010. And you see on top here the 4330. And the orange bars would be negatives, and the blue bars would be positives. So you can see from 2010 to 2022, you've largely had every year a decline in the main, with the exception of a bit of a bump in production in 2018, this blue bar here. So we've been coming down. If you think about it as an escalator, we've been coming down the gas production escalator. And that coming down the escalator, if you look at it, yeah, there was some coming down here in the period when I was minister, but the dramatic declines have really happened in the last, I would say, 3 years. You could see some big declines taking place in 2020 and 2021, right? And this is just the same graph expressed in percentages. So natural gas production is a problem, and it's affecting not just the governments and the government's ability to collect revenue, but it will affect everybody, because that's the pulse of the economy. This graph now shows the relationship with why is natural gas production important. So this graph shows that line there is real GDP for the last 10 years, 2012 to 2022. And you could see the graph coming down after 2015. I think our highest GDP was either 2015 or 2014, around there. And that simply means, that's the peak of Trinidad's economy was around 2014 and 2015. And this is a graph of gas, of oil, not just gas production, oil and gas production. And I keep toggling that back and forth. You're all seeing that relationship? That relationship is highly correlative, highly correlative. So this is not just, the blue line is not just gas production, it's oil and gas represented as one unit called barrels of oil equivalent. And you can see oil and gas production highly correlated. So the government should be, making best efforts to get oil production and gas production back up, but it has not really been happening, right? And that is where we get into the Dragon project and why the Dragon project is important and why the Manatee project is important and so on. One of the reasons why we are having this sharp decline, and there are many reasons why we're having this sharp decline in gas production, right? If we go back to this graph here, is that we've gone through a period, I would show, where there's been a withdrawal of enthusiasm by many companies to explore for oil and natural gas in Trinidad and Tobago. 1, 2, our gas reservoirs are naturally maturing, and we are not replacing those maturing gas fields with new gas fields, right? So those would be 2 of the major reasons why this graph has come down the way it has come down. But that affects everything, and it's important that we understand that it affects, the economy at the ground level. If you look at employment in the energy sector between 2011 and 2022, and this is not my data, this is CSO data, then a pretty obvious trend emerges. And again, the high point in the graph, 23,400 people. This is the y-axis is persons with jobs in the Trinidad and Tobago energy sector. And this information comes from the Central Statistical Office Labor Market Survey reports. So what I did, I downloaded all the reports, as you could see, right? And these are quarterly reports, and I took the time to plot this graph. And it shows that the high point for this period, 2011 to 2022, is really 23,400, and that would have been around mid-2013. And the low point is 6,900, which was the second quarter of last year. And then there was a bit of rebound after that, but you could see the general trend is downward. And if you talk to people in the energy sector, this story presents itself. If you travel and you go, you meet people in the airports and they are in the process of relocating to Canada. And this has happened to me on several occasions. When I'm traveling internationally, people come up to me and say they used to work in the energy sector in Trinidad and now they're trying to resettle in Calgary and in the UK and so on. So the natural question, people might watch this graph and say, well, this is because Petrotrin closed down. This is not only because Petrotrin closed down. And if you look at the graph carefully, you could see where Petrotrin closed down on this graph. And that's this area right here on the graph. You all seen that? So Petrotrin was closed down in around the fourth quarter of 2018. So this is the period we're talking about here. This is the Petrotrin closure period right here. So that's part of the story. That's part of the story, but there's a bigger story. And it is the fallout from the closure of things like Train 1, a few of the plants in Point Lisas and so on, that has caused loss of jobs. And of course, people have been asking, where did all these people go? Because we're talking on average about 10,000 people gone home from the energy sector. And again, you know, this, I could back this up with a lot more data if anybody wants a challenge, but I suspect they may. Where did the people go? Well, some of them went to Guyana. Some of them went to, in fact, I was talking to a few Trinidadians working on the drill ships and so on, and you know, Trinidadians are working on the drill ships and on the FPSOs and so on. Some of them have gone to Suriname. Some of them have gone to Calgary. Some of them have gone to Houston. And some of them are just home in Trinidad and Tobago, and they've gone into their own businesses and so on. And others are just, you know, floundering around. But the fact of the matter is that the energy sector has lost about 47% of its workforce in the last 7 years. And we must begin to question, why is that? Because if this is, if somebody tells me that the engine of the economy has lost 47% of its labor force, I would be concerned. Would you not be concerned? Right? And the question is, how do we turn this around? Or can it be turned around? Or is it too late to turn this around? Right? This is, and these two graphs paint similar pictures. This is now a graph of drilling activity for the period 2012 to 2022. And again, the trend emerges that there has been a significant drop-off in drilling activity after 2015. In fact, I could tell you, when I left office in 2015, BP had 3 to 4 rigs working in Trinidad and Tobago. Today, they have 1 rig. They've gone through periods in recent times where they've had no rigs drilling in Trinidad and Tobago. And these things have effects. Effects for places like 𝚤𝚤𝚜, effects for places like Labre, effects for places like Chaguaramas. And Chaguaramas, you know, is a major hub for oil and gas services. So the trend is reflected to me in employment in the energy sector. And I actually have this graph going back to 1991 because Professor Hussein likes to go back to as far back as possible. So he had a 1991 version to this graph, which I recreated. And of course, drilling, as I said, is down. So what does the future really hold? My analysis says that if there are no major game changers in gas production, our production is going to stay below 3 billion cubic feet of gas per day, which is insufficient to really take this country to really grow the economy in a meaningful way. Train 1 has been down. Atlantic Train 1 has been down since November 2020. This year would make it 3 years that has been down. I could tell you Train 1 will never restart, right? There's simply no, 1, there's no plan to restart Train 1, and 2, there simply is no gas to restart Train 1. Even if we get gas from Dragon, who knows when that will be, that is insufficient to restart Train 1. And then the capital expenditure required to get a train which has been down for 3, 4, 5, 6 years restarted you know, it will be very, very much an obstacle to restarting the train. The refinery in Pointe-à-Pierre was also, a lot of people don't know, the refinery in Pointe-à-Pierre was also a major user of natural gas. That refinery has now been down for, this year will make it 5 years. Can the refinery restart? Yes, it can. But every day that goes by, the cost to restart the refinery increases. You would agree. The other question is, when you're trying to sell, and I'm just using a simple analogy here, when you're trying to sell a car, is it better you sell the car while it's working, or is it better you sell the car after you park up under your house under a tarpaulin for 5 years? Which version of the car is going to is going to stimulate the interest in the buyer? Of course, the refinery should have been sold, in my opinion. If it is you are trying to divest the refinery should have been sold while the refinery was operational. It's been down for 5 years, and the most recent figure which I have for a restart of the refinery places, I had done an analysis of this 3 years ago, and the figure I had come up with was $1 billion US. And more recently, I was talking to a colleague who says it's now north of $1 billion US, perhaps closer to $2 billion US. So restarting the refinery becomes a smaller and smaller probability as we go forward, and a more expensive proposition. So what are the game changers to change this gas production profile we have before us? Because the bars that you're seeing in front of you are not touching 3 billion cubic feet of gas per day, or 3,000 million standard cubic feet of gas per day, even with the Manatee project coming into production in 2027. And there are two game changers. One is, of course, getting gas from Venezuela to flow into Trinidad, which the current government, they've been pursuing the Dragon project. Previous governments have pursued, in our time, we were pursuing the Loran Manatee project. Prior to that, the previous government under Mr. Manning, they too were pursuing the Loran Manatee project. It is something which successive governments, going back, according to Mr. Jupiter, according to Professor Jupiter, going back 30 years, have been pursuing. It has not happened, and it has become more difficult for Venezuelan gas to enter Trinidad because of the sanctions that the US government has put on Venezuela, I think back in 2018 and 2019 and so on. Really and truly, and those sanctions were put by the Trump administration and the US government, you know, but for a few little adjustments to allow Chevron, for example, to lift some crude oil from Venezuela to take it to the US, and but for the OFAC 2-year license granted to Trinidad, the US government has not really changed its stance on Venezuela. And my experience is that US foreign policy tends to be really driven from two levels. One is from the level of the executive, which is the presidency, and the other one is from the level of the people in the State Department. The public servants in the State Department wield a lot of influence. So by and large, the Biden administration has not done anything different from what Trump did. If you go to the State Department website and the Treasury Department website and the OFAC website, the sanctions that were put in place in the Trump era are largely still there. So the probability of gas from Venezuela coming to Trinidad, and I want to say, before somebody run off on some tangent and say we're not supporting that, I support that Dragon project. I would like to see gas from Venezuela enter Trinidad one day because it makes economic sense for the two countries, because we have infrastructure here that needs gas and they have gas, so it makes sense. But it has become increasingly more complex because of the situation with the sanctions, right? So I don't know. Initially, I had said that it would take 3 to 4 years. I think that is now an optimistic assessment of when that gas would come to Trinidad and Tobago. And I think largely, as the dust has settled in the last 4 to 5 weeks since the Prime Minister's announcement, I think the consensus has emerged that it is going to take some time. And even the Prime Minister couldn't really give a specific range of time as to when that gas will enter Trinidad. The second game changer is the one that I think that we should be focusing on. And certainly it's the deep water. So when I was part of the government led by former Prime Minister 𝚙𝚒𝚒𝚗𝚒, we did a lot of work with our deep water. And what we did is that we licensed 1.2 million hectares of our deep water acreage, which has never been, there's been no licensing of deep water acreage since 2014. And the reason why I didn't license any deep water acreage in 2015 is that 2015 was an election year, and 2, I thought that the Ministry of Energy staff needed a little downtime for them to go back and assess all that we had achieved between 2011 and 2015. But we signed, we signed 1.2 million hectares of deep water acreage into contract. We awarded 9 production sharing contracts, and that has manifested itself now into discoveries of natural gas to the northeast of Tobago, ranging between 3.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas to 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, depending on the source that you read. That is a significant amount of gas. However, it's located in very deep water. And when I say deep water, we define deep water in Trinidad as waters in excess of 1,000 meters. So whereas the Dragon Field has the obstacle of politics or geopolitics, the deep water in Trinidad has the obstacle of engineering and the obstacle of economics, because it becomes very expensive to develop that gas, which is to the northeast of Tobago, and to bring it to market in Trinidad, bring it down to 𝚙𝚒𝚒𝚒𝚗𝚒, where our gas, and Rushton is here with us, and most of our natural gas, right, about 85% of our natural gas enters Trinidad and Tobago in 𝚙𝚒𝚒𝚒𝚗𝚒, in a place called Abyssinia, right? Some of it enters in Point Fortin, some of it enters in Point Lisas, but the majority enters through in Mr. Parry's constituency, which makes his constituency very important and strategic. So hopefully they'll fix the roads in that area, Rushton, right? So we have to get that deep water to work. And I think it is imperative for the government, and by the government, I mean whoever is in government, to sit with the current owners of that deep water acreage, which is a company called Woodside, because BHP Billiton, you remember BHP Billiton, they are now Woodside because BHP was acquired by Woodside. So if we could get that deep water to work, which is our gas, we don't have to worry about the US and Venezuela and OFAC. That is our gas. If we could get that gas to come into our system, we could produce about 800 million cubic feet of gas per day from the deep water. And this graph from 2027, 2028 would look very different. So that to me is what could save Trinidad and Tobago's energy sector if we get gas from that deep water to come in. All right, so just to wind up and talk a bit about the future. If these things don't happen, this Venezuela Dragon and this Deepwater Woodside, then what of Trinidad and Tobago? What happens to us? What is going to propel this economy into the future? And therefore, I think we have to look at other means of propelling the economy beyond oil and gas. And I have been advocating for the development of the maritime sector. When we were in government, we started the construction of the Galeota port, and we completed the Galeota port in 2014. That port should have had a second phase completed by now, and that has never happened. And then there's infrastructure in La Brea, there's infrastructure in Point Lisas, there's infrastructure in Chaguaramas. Trinidad should be positioning itself to be the regional maritime logistics hub for the entire region. And that industry creates, as you know, thousands of jobs. right? Because it's a labor-intensive type industry. So that is one thing I think we need to do. The other thing we need to do is that we need to address this whole issue of ease of doing business, right? Because we are setting if we want investment from our private sector in our own economy, we need to remove the barriers to doing business in Trinidad and Tobago. And increasingly, it's becoming more and more difficult to get approvals. It's becoming more and more difficult to get licenses and so on, and to get things done from a business perspective. So those are two things. There are many others to look at, but those are two things that I would look at. One, the maritime sector, which I've been doing a lot of research on in the last 7 years. And the other one, of course, is, ease of doing business. So in summary, I would say that, the economy has contracted by about 19% in the last 7 years in terms of, measured in terms of real GDP. Our earning, our capacity to earn money has come down. We got a little reprieve from Vladimir Putin in 2022. I don't think that we're going to collect $56 billion this year. The Minister of Finance seems to be very confident. He dismissed 𝚒𝚒 last week in the Parliament and he said that the government was on target to collect the revenue it expected, but that was based on the first quarter of fiscal 2023 information. We don't know how the second quarter of fiscal 2023 will trend, and the third quarter and the fourth quarter. Prices are coming down. The price of ammonia, if I was to give you a little reference, the most recent price of ammonia as at the first week of March 2023, and this is ammonia sold in Point Lisas, is $550 per ton. In April 2022, that was, believe it or not, $1,600 a ton. So the geopolitical anxiety created by the Russia-Ukraine war has receded from the world's energy markets. And the result is that we're seeing gas prices coming down. We're seeing ammonia prices coming down. And largely what is driving that is the ability of the United States to export oil and natural gas. And that is where the world of 2023 is radically different from the world of 2003 or the world of 1973. The US shale revolution has changed, has flipped the whole world, and has made America able to support Germany with liquefied natural gas and to support other countries in Europe with liquefied natural gas, because America is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. When we started our LNG industry in 1999, America was hungry for imports of LNG. Now they are the world's largest exporter. So the world is not static and the world changes, and we as a small country in the Caribbean, we need to understand these trends and to position our country for it. Trinidad and Tobago, in my humble opinion, has tremendous potential, but we need to excite our country's private sector. We need to excite our population that, there's a brighter future ahead for this country. So I'll end right there and take any questions. That was 39 minutes.
All right, Kevin, I'll go for this if my colleagues allow me to. What very, very insightful, very as always, you never fail to disappoint. Your presentation was spot on in the analysis in where we are, where we should be, and where we could be. My question really is this, right? I mean, from your presentation, I'm sure lots of questions will come out, but I would like to ask you, the closure of Petrotrain 5 years ago, as you said, in hindsight now, they say that 2020 vision is what was he saying again? Something about 2020 vision is hindsight, but do you think that it was a mistake closing Petrotrain, looking at all the factors would have come to now with high gas prices and so on?
Let's look at, again, you say we are speaking with the benefit of hindsight, right? So we have to put that on the table. But when the case was being made for the closure of the refinery, one of the things being bandied about was that the refinery was 100 years old. You remember that?
Yep.
The refinery which was closed in November 2018 was not 100 years old. And that refinery, there was refining activity taking place in Point Lisas for over 100 years. But the refinery itself is a refinery that could be dated back to the 1950s. And there had been 3 upgrades of the refinery, one in the 1970s, one in the 1990s, and one between 2006 to 2014, of course, which I am very familiar with. In the most recent upgrade of the refinery, which I am, of course, I could speak to that, the approximately $1.7 billion was spent to upgrade the refinery.
Yeah.
And there are 5 brand new plants in the refinery, and the cat cracker itself, the FCCU unit, which we call the cat cracker, was upgraded, and that upgrade was completed in 2014. And when the upgrade was completed to satisfy the unions, the union wanted to make sure that it was safe, fit for work, right? Which is the term the HSC people use. And we hired Lloyd's of London to go and certify that the cat cracker was fit for use. So that's the first point. The first point is that a lot of what has happened to that investment, which is $1.7 billion, right? That has been lost because all those plants would now be deteriorating. We don't know what are the conditions or how those plants were mothballed and so on, whether they were blanketed with nitrogen and all that, right? So the thing is, the government has gone out for requests for interest and so on, RFIs and so on for this refinery, and they've not attracted. They had this back and forth with the union, with Patriotic Energies, that ended in naught. That nothing came of that. Then there was some talk about some other company. I don't want to call the name of the company, and that too didn't go anywhere. So it seems that there's very little interest from the big players. And if we are to restart the refinery, in my humble opinion, the government would need to step in and to partner with somebody who has deep pockets. And we're not talking about somebody here who has a suitcase and a jacket and tie and a call card, right? Because we know that type of personality. We're talking about the big, and I don't want to call names because you never know where I will be, down the road. And they would say he favored that company, and look, this recording where he said the company name, right? But I would think we would need people with the technology and the deep pockets to partner with the government or a government entity to restart the refinery. We are in the golden age of refining. Our refineries are making money hand over fist throughout the world because there is a demand for what they sell, which is gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And the world is going to need those things for the foreseeable future. While the energy transition is taking place, the world is going to continue to, I'm sure everybody on this call is going to put gas and diesel at some point in time this week coming here. So there is a chance we could restart the refinery, but we need to have a partner with the capital and the technology to partner with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, or a government entity. And that's the formula I see for it. The other thing is that, and I'm talking to people who used to work in the refinery at a very senior level. If you can't get interest in the entire refinery, then it is possible that you could look at putting out specific plants or specific groups of plants that could produce, some product, right? And maybe that might be something that would interest international players. But I think that it really is. I think one of my colleagues had calculated something using something called replacement cost. And if right now you were to go to buy a refinery, which could refine 165,000 barrels of crude oil per day, you would probably have to fork out about $7 billion to buy a refinery similar to what we have in Pointe-à-Pitre. It is very disheartening to pass on that highway and see that refinery the way it is.
Correct.
Okay, I just want to say good night to everyone who joined us on YouTube and Facebook. The last time I checked, we had a little over 300 viewers. So Kevin, that just shows you the level of excitement we've had for this program.
That's
Right?
good to hear. Yes.
MP 𝙲𝚛𝚒𝚒𝚘𝚗𝚜, I see MP 𝙲𝚛𝚒𝚒𝚘𝚗𝚒 with his hand up. MP 𝚒𝚒𝚗𝚒𝚗, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So please go ahead.
Hi, good night, and thank you very much for having me. Kevin, as usual, you are you're spot on with your delivery. I like the storyline. I mean, you were very clear from the beginning, and I think if anyone could say that they didn't understand what you say, well, then I think they don't want to understand. I have some quick questions that probably will bring some clarity for even myself. If we were to just, I think the last point you made concerning the refinery. Now, while I was in South Korea a couple of years ago, I was having some conversations with a couple of the parliamentarians across there, and the issue of energy had come up. And I was wondering, you estimated that it would take between $1 and $2 billion to bring our oil refinery back into production. But you answered just now that it may take $7 billion to bring a similar size refinery if we have to purchase one. But based on the fact that we probably can peak internally about 60 to 100,000 barrels of oil if Heritage gets its mojo going, bringing or building or purchasing a smaller plant, probably in the vicinity of about 60 to 100,000 barrels of oil refining. Is that something that we should be pursuing when you look at and the reason why I mentioned Korea, in the conversation, they were saying that between $2 to $3 billion, US can land you a smaller refinery pre-built out of Korea with all the newest technology, modern technology that could put probably 400 to 500 people to work at a very modern, efficient level. So I think the question I want to ask, which you partly answered, does it make sense for us to invest in a new refinery, smaller, that we can get some economies of scale, make some money, and leave the old refinery that Dr. Rowley has turned into a virtual scrapyard? Is that something that is feasible for conversation going forward?
Well, yeah, so that has been true now to me. There's something called a modular refinery. And if you just go on Google modular refinery, you would see who the world leaders in modular refineries are. So Trinidad and Tobago needs about 25,000 barrels of fuel per day. So that is gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, kerosene, and so on, right? The largest one, of course, being gasoline. So a small modular refinery could do that, or a scaled-down version of the point-of-care refinery. And we would have to weigh the two and look at the economics of doing the two. But we have to start thinking about our own energy security, right? Because you don't know what the world is going to look like. I mean, if there is if the war in Ukraine was to spill over into NATO countries, and you were to have, God forbid, something resembling a version of World War III, is that an improbable scenario at this point in time? I mean, I don't know. Russia, I'm sure you would agree that is not an improbable scenario.
Agreed.
Right? I mean, we have a war on the European continent for the first time since the Balkans War of the early 90s, and before that, World War II. So we have to start thinking about water security, food security, and energy security. And certainly, I think I would look at the two options and run the economics on them. But I have been studying that modular refinery approach too, because a lot of people have been also pushing that idea in Guyana, right? To do a small type refinery to meet the demands of the Guyanese population. So it is I would look at the economics of the two. But I would really, it is difficult for me to think that we're walking away from the $1.7 billion US we spent between 2006 and 2014 to upgrade the refinery, right? Because I mean that money is, I mean, 𝚖𝚘𝚒𝚗𝚒𝚗𝚗𝚜 had a new lab, which I'm told is a world-class lab, right? Because 𝚖𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚗𝚗𝚗 would have to be testing fuel and so on to make sure the fuels meet international standards and so on. So all that is, I don't know what has become of all that.
I have another question on the dragon gas component, right? And I understand from Stuart Young's last delivery in the parliament, he said that within the next 3 or 4 weeks, a team of technocrats and other specialists will be going to Venezuela to continue the negotiations. Now, my view is that that should have been done up front rather than waiting till after both he and Dr. Rowley got basically thrown out of Caracas for whatever reason. And they're now going there for the third time to do what they were supposed to do up front. Now, my question is, the fact that the United States government, the OFLAC office, has been very stern with regards to the payment issue. I think that's where the stumbling block is, in the fact that you are not allowed to pay in the US. Do you think that there is wiggling room in Washington? And I see Dr. Amory Brown is heading to Washington to meet with the Secretary of State sometime this week. I don't know if that arrangement is on the schedule of conversations with him. But do you think there is wiggle room that through effective and good diplomacy between Trinidad and Tobago and Washington, that we can ask for a softening, further softening of the arrangement between the U.S. State Department, the Treasury Department, and that OFLAC arrangement, where maybe just soften and give some money, some cash, some goods and services, with the underlying conversation that, look, the United States government foreign policy is to make the region, the Caribbean, Latin American region, less reliant on Chinese soft money. And I'm saying, is there diplomacy room where we can tell the US government, look, guys, you want us to be less reliant on Chinese soft money? Help us. This is a critical industry for us. It's going to help put our people back to work. It's going to help do A, B, C, D, F, G. Is there wiggle room to soften that arrangement with OFLAC and that payment that is definitely the stumbling block in the negotiations right now? Do you think?
Well, you know, I read in the papers today where Russia is offering Trinidad visa-free travel to Russia, right? I believe Russian nationals don't need a visa to come to Trinidad. I stand to be corrected. But certainly when I visited Moscow in 2013 and 2014, I needed to get a visa. And we had to send my passport down to Georgetown, right? And they had to put the visa into my passport and send it back to Port of Spain and so on. So it is interesting that Russia is making that offer to Trinidad. And we do have diplomatic relations with Russia. The Russian ambassador to Georgetown has designation for Trinidad, and he comes to Trinidad from time to time. But the larger point is coming to what you are saying. There is a tug of war for geopolitical influence in the region between the United States and China, and Russia to some extent. Russia has interest in Venezuela. The gas fields next to Dragon were given to Russia in lieu of a debt that Venezuela owed Russia. And of course, China has investments in Trinidad and in Venezuela and, in the region. So you're right, there is always things that could be achieved through diplomacy. I think the 2-year license is insufficient, of course, to get anything done, but I expect that license could be rolled over or extended or something like that, right? But the 2 years is still, in my opinion, a difficult period of time for companies to make an investment decision, right? So I don't think any investment decision for a project like that would be made with a 2-year time horizon. And if you're looking at Shell and possibly NGC investing, they would definitely need more than 2 years. So it is early days. The point is, it is early days yet for the Dragon project. And I think that where we should continue to focus on it, of course, because I mean, I could tell you, we worked with Venezuela very hard to make things happen with Loran and Manatee and so on, and so did the previous government, Mr. Manning's government. So I expect that will continue to be Trinidad's foreign policy, regardless of who is in government. I mean, if you are the Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2.5 years, Rushton, I expect that you would continue to pursue with equal vigor or greater vigor getting Venezuelan gas to come to Trinidad. So it's been consistent foreign policy of the country, and we would like to see it happen. But at the same time, as I pointed out, we have our own gas to develop. We have our own mangoes and oranges to pick, right? And I'm saying that we should be going after deepwater gas.
Kevin,
right?
and I don't want to take up too much time. I have one question to close off, and it comes out right on the end of what you were saying here concerning our deep waters, right? Now, coming out of the energy conference that I attended, and there were some very key comments that were made during the first day after Stuart Young had an opening bowl when he says that if Trinidad doesn't get the best deal, there will be no deal. I don't think that comment rubbed off well with the attendees, those representatives of the oil companies over there, because to start a negotiation with a 16-inch concrete block, that is not negotiation at all. And coming out of the day, when you hear the rumblings and grumblings, I think that was a key issue. So the question that I want to ask, in terms of deep water exploration, being a former minister of energy, and you would have been privy to what these financial terms are normally, or in terms of like tax regimes and so on, do you think there's room now for better terms and conditions entering the deep water, more specifically in terms of the profit sharing percentages, which coming out of the energy conference, I would told it was somewhere between 60 and 65%, which is extremely high, knowing that there are new and emerging territories that are asking for a lot less. Is that something we can maneuver with going forward?
So coming back to this whole issue of investment, and you're a businessman, taking the approach that is either we get the best deal or no deal, right? 100% of zero is zero, right? So if you want to play that, if you want to play it like that, you end up with zero. And that might be why the government has not been successful with licensing deepwater acreage. There was a bid round in 2018/2019 for shallow water acreage that ended up with no licenses being awarded. They got 4 bids and they never signed any licenses. Then there was a deepwater bid round, which I think it closed in 2022 or 2021. They got 4 bids. To this day, we don't know what happened to them. So 100% of zero is zero. The world that we live in, companies have options, right? They could go to Guyana. Guyana has a bid round going on. Suriname has a bid round going on. They could go to Africa. So we have to be competitive, right? With regard to those production sharing contracts for those blocks to the northeast of Tobago, which was signed by yours truly back in 2012, so long ago, 11 years ago, there is an argument for the government to sit with the current holders of those production sharing contracts and find out, what does it require to make this investment happen. And it may be that, again, we have to look at the percentage of government take, because when those contracts were signed in 2012, it was a different world. So we have to start to think a bit differently now about how we try to attract investment into Trinidad, because it is a different time and a different world that we're living in. And ultimately what you want is that gas to run into Guayagüeyari, run straight across the island to Atlantic LNG and up to Point Lisas and create jobs. When you go to Point Lisas and you see the amount of people who work in Point Lisas, and you go to the food court and you see all these young people in the coveralls and so on, in Atlantic Plaza and so on, it tells you how important that is, and that is something you want to sustain. So the thing is, we must not only look at investment from the point of view of taxation and what the government will get. And I think that has been a fundamental flaw with this government, that they look at the investment from the private sector and the multinationals from the point of view of what the government could collect, royalties and taxes and so on, but they don't look at the wider benefits to the society from investment, which is the supply chain support, the creation of employment, the spend that takes place within the economy. When a company decides to do a turnaround in Point Lisas, you could see a visible difference in the amount of trucks moving in and out of Point Lisas. You could see a visible difference in the food court. And that has nothing to do with government collecting corporation tax and royalties, That is just companies spending money. So I agree with you that we have to think differently about how we approach that deep water. And if it is that there is a compromise which is needed, then we have to find out what that is. But just sitting down here in 2023, and I was talking to a very experienced energy expert who was telling me that we have to make a move on the deep water in 2023, or else it will be too late, right? The way things are trending with gas production, it will be too late. So I'm hoping that something happens in 2023 and we hear some positive news from Woodside.
All right. Thank you, Lisha. Let someone else take over. If there is time before we close, I may have a couple follow-up. Thank you again, Kevin.
Sure, absolutely, 𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑 and thank you for your questions and your contribution. I am seeing 𝙲𝚛𝚒𝚒𝚑 with her hand up. Would you like to go ahead?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Good night, Kevin. One of the important things that you were interviewed with on the morning program, I believe it was TV6 a year ago, and the discussion that centered around Petrotrin, and you made a very important statement that resonated not just with me, but with many of the presidents of the Confederation of Chambers, of Regional Business Chambers. You had exclaimed that those who took the decision to close down the refinery were people who were not known in the refining world or the oil and gas world. And I think that was one of the most significant statements that ever emanated out of it, because and again, I'm not being political, but what I am saying that decisions are being taken without being properly thought through, without bringing in the independent experts, past and present, to sit and explain a type of scenario planning of what will happen to the economy, what will happen to the environment if this refinery closes down. And one of the casualties, I'm just giving one small example, is the roads, because there's an absence of bitumen. We have to start importing bitumen when we make it here. So closing down that refinery or not even having it run as a going concern is a catastrophic decision was taken by this government regarding our energy security. But I have a question, Kevin, and only you will address that when you speak. So I'll get down to the question. I'm happy that you spoke about Point Lisas. And to members of the audience, I am a keen reader of a journalist called Curtis Williams. He's now with the Express. And he wrote an article in the Wednesday Business Express about Point Lisas. And I will just give a very encapsulated part of it. He was saying that when companies need to do their shutdowns or turnarounds, and that requires a substantial investment, and Kevin talked about trucks moving in and out, people moving in and out, contractors are being contracted for work. They go to the bank for very substantial borrowings. The conditions of the commercial banks here to these plants is that we want to lend you the money, we want to support your operations, it's important for the country, it's profitable for you and for us. But we are not giving you a loan unless you have a 5-year contract from NGC. Right now, NGC is giving out 2- and 3-year contracts, according to the article, Kevin. And when, right, according to the article. So I'm asking you, Kevin, and I'm looking at what happened with Atlantic Train 1, where BP cannot continue its infill program to have Train 1 running. And again, a lot of articles was written about it by Curtis Williams to the point where, and I'm making my own conclusion and speaking in my own personal capacity, where Conrad Endell had to end up demitting office in NGC and go to be the ambassador to Guyana. Kevin, the bottom line and the straightforward question is, do we have enough gas, Kevin? Thanks.
Well, the answer is no. If we had enough gas, the Train 1 plant would be operating, the Titan methanol plant would be operating, the MHTL M1 plant would be operating, the Yara ammonia plant would be operating. And plants in Point Lisas would have been getting longer term contracts. So the point that Jai is making is that these plants in Point Lisas, they don't run flat out. They have to stop and do what is called turnarounds, which are periods of maintenance. And that could sometimes last 2 to 3 weeks. And the cost of those turnarounds could run between $70 million US to $100 million US. When those turnarounds are happening, it is a very positive thing for the contracting community because contractors get a lot of work. But because companies are not getting longer term gas contracts, they can't justify among themselves an investment of $100 million US in a turnaround. All right, so it is as though you have a taxi and you only have, work for 2 years for the taxi. Will you go and spend money to do an engine job and a body job on the taxi? And that is the conundrum which plants in Point Lisas find themselves in 2023. The solution to everything we talk about here tonight is to produce more natural gas. And I mean, it is, as I said, it's becoming more and more challenging to do that. One, the fiscal regime that governs the energy sector in Trinidad is not conducive to the level of investment that we need to get production back up. And I think Rushton pointed out there is clearly a need to have a look at the terms and conditions governing the deep water reserves. I mean, and perhaps I'm not saying that it is something that must happen, but it is a conversation that probably has to happen between the government and Woodside. But the thing is, these things are taking very long to happen. And while time is passing, time is going, and the country doesn't have the dynamism, especially from its main economic actor, the energy sector, that is required. And I think there was an article in The Guardian today, page 9 of The Guardian, Dr. Tiwari had brought it to my attention, that talked about the level of frustration of highly qualified young people who can't find jobs. And that is because the economy is not creating the opportunities for companies to invest that will create jobs. You remember there was a time when you go through the papers in Trinidad and Tobago and every other page was a big advertisement for jobs. You don't see that. I mean, I know somebody would say, go to Caribbean jobs online. But I mean, even there, the amount of vacancies and so on that you're seeing being reported and so on is a lot less. So we have a duty as a country to create the economic conditions that will keep our young people here and not send them to Canada, cause them to go to the US and the UK or Guyana and so on. And I'm not seeing that anxiety to create that level of excitement in the economy. And I'm not seeing the level of excitement from the local private sector that we ought to see. And I have always maintained that the local private sector is a sleeping giant that we need to wake up.
But Kevin, there's an elephant in the room. Sorry, there's an elephant in the room, right? And for some reason, nobody seems to be addressing it, which is Guyana has discovered vast amounts of oil and gas and extracting it now. If there was a robust treaty or arrangement between Trinidad and Guyana, couldn't that be the third option for us to bring in the gas, the much needed gas, into our shores?
Yeah, so Guyana is producing a bitter gas. It's not a big quantity of gas. They are more oil producing country. So they are producing what is called associated gas, which is gas associated with the current oil production. Down the road, they may produce more natural gas, but the distance from Guyana to Trinidad would not support a pipeline. It could support liquefied natural gas from Guyana to Trinidad, but that is something down the road. Right? That is a possibility, but that is down the road. At this point in time, the Guyanese government is quite rightly using their natural gas to solve one of their major problems in Guyana, which is the cost of electricity. So they are putting their natural gas into power generation. You can't blame them. That's the way to go.
Okay, Kevin, looks like we're going to have you until 9:30. Now, I am seeing a couple hands up. Brandon is a former Petrotrin employee and he has put quite a bit on the chat. So I want to give him the opportunity to make his contribution, and then we could take Richard, followed by Ramdev. Brandon?
Hi, good night.
Good night.
First of all, thanks for the opportunity. I've never been in a forum like this, and I'm glad this is the first one I'm privy to because it's really piqued my interest. And as mentioned before, I did work in Petrotrin and I was working on the sulfuric acid regeneration plant. And I noticed someone asked about, well, would the refinery have been sustainable? And I could say before the cat cracker upgrade, I would have seen the difficulty in it being profitable, but post that cat cracker upgrade, we were able to produce alkylate, which was one of the most expensive products that we were putting out on the market. As well as simple as the acid plant was definitely entering the market, Yara used to purchase this acid imported at around 8,000 US per ton, and we would have introduced acid at 2,000 per ton, and we definitely had a lot of diversity in the refinery with the oil. Secondly, I also worked offshore and working on a KCSC platform where the objective is a compression platform, this meaning that they're preparing to remove the last remains of natural gas in these fields. So with that question, with that, I would have liked to ask, is that a projection of because I noticed as well, prior to 2019, in your graphs, there was a slight decrease in the production. Was that because of the government, or is it just that the fields are drying up? And is that the long-term destiny for natural gas in our country, or is it more better deals need to be brokered, or is BP even interested in continuing working within our fields?
Well, Brandon, you asked a very profound question there.
Yeah.
Now, which I will invite you to help me answer this question, right?
Sure.
When BP takes a decision to invest in compression as opposed to investing in exploration, what does that say?
Basically, to put it in the smallest term, if you could imagine you're drinking a pack from a pack of orchard and you're trying to get the dregs out of that orchard, you're about to really pull through that straw. So that's what the compression platform really is about, to really pull at the dregs.
So instead of going and look for a new pack of orchard, right, which is exploration,
right,
you're looking to suck on what left at the bottom of the orchard pack, right?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So that is what compression is. Compression, for those of you all who may not know, compression is simply a big vacuum, right? Which the technical term is that it will drop the wellhead pressure in the wells because it's a vacuum, and stimulate the wells to produce what is left, as Brandon says, what is remaining in those fields. So the fact that BP had opted to go to compression tells me that the Columbus Basin is very mature, right? The Columbus Basin, where most of our hydrocarbons have been produced from in the last 50 years, is approaching a level of maturity. And therefore, we have to look from an exploration point of view. We have to look at new areas, which is why we placed between 2011 and 2015 almost laser-like attention on Deepwater, because we knew that we had to find new sources of oil and natural gas. And I could tell you that when the ministry under my watch was pursuing Deepwater, we were of the view that it was oil. And what BHP and now Woodside has found is largely gas, which complicates the whole issue, because the economics of oil and the economics of gas are two different sets of economics. But that point aside, we still have a duty, in my opinion, to continue to develop and try to bring to market that deep water. And with the point you're making about the refinery, I could tell you that in 2016, April 2016, less than a year after we left office, there was a joint select committee on Petrotrin. And the then president of Petrotrin said in the joint select committee in April 2016 that the refinery was a bright spot of Petrotrin. The refinery was working very well. It was close to capacity, and uptime was good, and so on. And then the refinery was allowed to go into decline. The other thing is that one of the things that was bandied about was that we were hearing that Petrotrin was a drain on the treasury. Petrotrin was a ward of the Ministry of Finance, and those things would, and certainly in my time, Petrotrin was never given money. In fact, Petrotrin used to give us money, right? Because we collected about $20 billion in taxes and royalties from Petrotrin between 2010 and 2015. Another thing people don't know is that, and somebody mentioned bitumen. So Petrotrin provided the country with bitumen. Now we have to import bitumen. Petrotrin also supplied the country with LPG. And Brandon, where did the LPG come from in the refinery? Was it the cat cracker or the topping units?
The topping units.
So Petrotrin supplied this country with LPG. And now Petrotrin is closed. So where do we get our LPG from? Well, NP has to get LPG now from Phoenix Park Gas Processors Limited. And that LPG is sold to NP at market price, right? And then the government has to come and reimburse NP because NP would be selling it at subsidized prices. So Petrotrin supplied the country with LPG, with bitumen, and the refinery up to 2016, as far as I'm aware, was working pretty well. So I'm glad for your perspective on the refinery and your reference to the upgrade of the cat cracker, which, as you know, was something which took a few years, right? And it was, I could tell you, it was a constant headache for me.
Yeah, with the divine intervention on your all behalf with Jonathan Baden entering the topic, he really whipped that back into shape.
Yeah, and I always remember that the union had made a point about, essentially the union wanted some assurance that the cat cracker was safe, right, to operate.
Yeah, and that's what Lloyds had provided.
And we said, okay, let's get the best in the world to come and certify this cat cracker. We got Lloyds to come in. So thanks for bringing that perspective. But who knows, one day we will see the refinery back into operation again.
Hopefully. Just two quick points again I'd like to make. With the US pushing this entire green energy agenda, how do you foresee the oil and gas future? And are these graphs that you've presented tonight available for the public? Because if so,
yeah, what I will do, I'll PDF them and send them to Lisha, and she could share them to anybody who wants them. All right.
Sure. Okay. Thanks so much. And
yeah,
well,
so coming out to the US, and so the Democratic Party, which is the current ruling party of the US, is very much pushing this whole green agenda, as is most of the countries in the European Union. So there are different views on demand for oil going into the future. But the consensus is that the demand for crude oil will continue to rise and will peak somewhere in the year 2035, which is not that far away. After that, global demand for oil will gradually decline. But there is going to be, out of 2050, there is still going to be a demand for oil. But the world is, as you pointed out, in an irreversible energy transition. And Trinidad and Tobago cannot be left behind. And as far as I'm concerned, we pretty much far behind at this point in time compared to what you're seeing happening in places like Jamaica and in places like Barbados and so on. And we should have more electric vehicles on the road. We should have more charging stations. The government, I'm not totally negative about the current government. The government has done, they've pursued a solar project with BP Lightsource, and I congratulate them on that. They've signed the production, the PPA, the power purchase agreement, and the license and so on, but it's time to implement it and get it off the ground. So that's positive, but I think we have a lot of work to do to catch up with the developed world in terms of the energy transition. And I think that we have to set targets in Trinidad for the infusion of electric vehicles into our country. But so that's just one aspect of the energy transition. The other aspect could be things like LEDs and smart grids and so on. But we can't be left behind.
Brandon, I want to thank you for your questions and your contributions. And we are absolutely thrilled to hear that this is the first time you're on a program like this and you have chosen critical conversations with the Campus Foundation. So I hope you continue to join us. Mr. Tang Lee, Mr. Tang Lee, you want to go ahead? Mr. Tang Lee?
Good night.
Okay. Good night. Good night.
Good night, all. I'd like to ask a question. Was there a provision put in place within domestic law in Trinidad and Tobago for local content? You see, Guyana have it. Guyana have it, and they're using for the people, for it to work for the people, So you have local employment. Was there a provision put in place for it, Mr. Amrai?
There is. So we don't have a local content law in Trinidad. What we have is a local content policy, which has been built into our production sharing contracts and our licenses. But there is no law. Guyana went the extra mile and they passed a local content law, which has certain, which has mandated certain percentages of local content in certain aspects of the energy sector. But I would like your point of view, Richard. Do you think we need a law in Trinidad?
Yes, Mr. Ramnay, we do need a provision in place, because if you look at the 𝚤𝚤𝚉, is the energy hub down there. You have Point Lisas, you have things extracting from the Earth's core, and yet this been happening for years. We had different companies, Amoco people change names, and you haven't have provisions in place for our people. If you look at 𝚤𝚤𝚉 in itself, you don't even have a hospital to deal with burns or chemical, and you have the industrial hub down on that side, the southeast coast. And they don't even have a hospital in Mayaro to manage that. You only have a health center. So again, we're not seeing the value of the people itself, and what you're going to do, just give her notes every time for Christmas or stuff like that. We fooling the people. And I think that the opposition and independent senators and trying to big parliament, not stimulating the present government to put provisions in place. And again, Mr. Parry, he's a man from down on that side, and he should be championing these causes, because you're managing the MP for the area down on that side, and these things should happen,
Yeah, so I'm grateful to hear your point of view about whether you think we should legislate, pass a law for local content. So thanks for that point of view. But I think local content goes a bit deeper than just hospitals and so on. It's about involving more local labor, involving more local service companies, and it's also about greater ownership by nationals of Trinidad and Tobago in the energy sector. So one of the things that I'm still very proud of is the TTNGL IPO, which we did right before election, August 2015. We floated, I think it was 20% of Phoenix Park gas processors on the stock exchange, and it was oversubscribed by, it still remains, I think, the largest IPO in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. But your point is well taken, Richard, and I think there is a growing need to put down our foot with regard to local content, because I'm getting the stories from people in the energy sector that our local service companies are still being excluded in favor of foreign companies for work that they could perform as good as or better than the foreign company. So once a service could be done by a Trinidadian company, it should be done by a Trinidadian company and not a foreign company.
Okay, I'm just doing a quick time check. I'm saying it's 9:25. So we have 2 hands up. Maybe we could take those 2 contributions if you all promise to make it quick, and then we close off. So Ramdale?
Yeah, good night all, and thank you very much. I want to tell Mr. Tang something. If you listen to the parliamentary channel, you're going to realize that all MPs are working very hard and asking all the appropriate questions. It takes a lot to stimulate this government. That being said, Brandon asked the question I wanted to ask on green energy.
Brandon, make me laugh, boy.
Yeah. Brandon asked the question I wanted to ask on green energy. But do you think that given green energy is the future, should we concentrate on that now? And really, given all the challenges with the current energy situation, we should direct our energies into green energy. That one. Two, you mentioned it before. Coleman Booth said that the Prime Minister negotiated higher prices, UK prices, rather than Brent crude. Could you explain that, if that is possible, or if that is feasible?
Well, Mr. Imbut always gives partial information. So he says that we are no longer using Henry Hub. We're using what they call JKM, Japan Korea marker, and we're using the national balancing point from the UK to price our gas. But he didn't say where. I mean, we have hundreds of gas contracts, and my understanding is that those markers were used for the new Train 1 formula. But Train 1 has not operated since for the last 2 years. And it remains to me a mystery as to whether those markers are being used for trains 2, 3, and 4. So we don't know. So there is a need for Mr. Imbut to give more information. But as far as I'm aware, those markers were used for the new Train 1 formula. And of course, I think I was making the point to somebody that, the price of the mango is one thing, but the other thing is you have to have mangoes to sell, right? And again, we come back to natural gas production. You could have a marker, a Japanese Korea marker. You could have a national balancing point marker for the UK. You could have a marker for Holland. At the end of the day, you have to have gas. You have to have gas to sell. And as I pointed out, our gas production is something like about 37% less than it was 12 years ago. So yeah, so he could talk about those prices and so on. And he didn't go any further to say, all where they were applied. But to me, the fundamental issue is gas production.
Thank you.
Okay, Trinity Bone, final contribution.
Yes, I'll try to keep it short. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and another interesting and informative presentation, Kevin. Excellent job, and Mr. MP Parry, and all the contributors thus far. Continuing from where our last speaker was talking about Mr. Imbut telling us that our gas price was pegged to some different margin. He never explained to us how much we are fetching for gas, but he pegged it in the budget at $6.
No, exactly.
How are we to find out? How are we to find out?
Exactly. He should have said how much we realize for natural gas for at least the first 3 months of the fiscal year.
Exactly.
Right? Because remember, the fiscal year is October, November, December. That's the first quarter of the fiscal year.
So his answers to the question.
And he should have had data. He should have had data for January 2023. So you are right. He should have said what was the average realized price for gas for the first 4 months of the fiscal year. And I have not read his Hansard, right? But I didn't see it reported in the papers.
Well, I was very attentive. He just walked around it and never gave a number.
Yeah. So, but my view is that given where the Henry Hub prices, because we still base our gas sales to some extent on Henry Hub, we do base some of our gas sales on the price index, the price of ammonia and so on. Even if you were to buy his argument about the Japan-Korea marker and the national balancing point, all those prices are trending sharply downwards.
Exactly.
Right? So his dismissal of Weidmach, I mean, Weidmach may be able to come back 6 months down the road and prove him wrong.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that, it is not something to dismiss. It is something to be concerned about.
Right. Coming back to the idea of our fields, our oil fields and our gas fields being mature fields, you spoke about compression at BP. That is enhanced oil and gas recovery. The same thing we have to apply in our oil fields. We should be looking down the line And I know for a fact that a particular lease operator for the last 5 years have been trying to get into nitrogen injection and have applied to the government, and they are being given the runaround. Enhance oil recovery so we can bring back our oil production back up to close to 100 barrels per day.
So you're right. You're totally right, because I had this conversation all the time. The majority of oil that has been discovered in Trinidad is still in the ground.
Correct.
What has been produced has been produced using what they call primary recovery, which is oil being produced on its own pressure, right?
Correct.
So, but
Correct.
once the reservoir pressure goes, you have oil which is stranded in the ground. And the only way to do that is to recharge the reservoir using nitrogen or carbon dioxide. So you are correct. The future of oil production is what we call enhanced oil recovery, which is nitrogen, CO2, water flooding and so on. But that, of course, requires investment. And as we pointed out, people are not excited to invest for many reasons. One of which is the whole ease of doing business thing, and the other one is the tax regimes.
Okay, I see 𝚑𝚑 has some final remarks to make.
Yes, thank you, Lisha. Just before you close, I know we're stranded with time. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Tang Lee in that, I absolutely agree with him in terms of the issue around, the local content. We have had 1 or 2 instances in the last 2 or 3 years with regards to BP transferring some major contracts to global providers, while the global providers do have an agent in terms of a partner in Trinidad. What we found is that a lot of the work that would have gone to the local Mayaro contractors that eventually hire Mayaro people, whereas they may have been 100, now they may have 10, because these global providers with their partners who are sitting in Port of Spain or San Fernando, they tend to pick people up from those areas. So we did see a huge reduction in the ability to get work done for our locals, and that is something that I think we must address as well. Getting a local content law, I think, is important. I don't know if we want to go as aggressive as Guyana, but definitely to have something fulfilled. And I want to assure Mr. Tang that I, on 3 occasions, I've raised these matters during budget debates. I've raised these matters during motions on the adjournment in terms of Mayaro specific issues, and I have also gone so far. Now, while I do not subscribe of any politician walking into the offices of CEOs of energy companies and dictating pace to them, Kevin was absolutely right. You have to put it in the agreements up front. So it has to be part of how the work is spelled out going forward. What I have done over the last couple of years is when I do have my quarterly meetings with some of the energy company presidents, I will remind them how important it is to make sure that the fence line communities that they are operating in, work for the people becomes a priority. Even in this last issue with Heritage and the oil spill, together with the 𝚙𝚎 Village Council, we have made sure that the most amount of work that can be taken up from the people in 𝚙𝚎 to help with the cleanup, that is done. And not a contractor who is coming from Sipari or Pinal or Port of Spain is bringing the bulk of the labor. So I want to assure you, Mr. Tang, that it is part of the work that I have done as MP, and I want to assure you that I will continue doing that. So thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
𝚑𝚑, just on a point of information as we close, on the 16th of March 2023, Shell will be having a public consultation at the Mayaro Resource Center on the Manatee project. All right, so perhaps that might be a good place for you to make a point about labor.
I have
and getting as much people from Rio Claro, Mayaro involved in the Manatee project.
Definitely.
Okay, before I pass you all on to the PRO to close off, I just want to make a few remarks as president of the foundation. Kevin, I want to say this was excellent. It was very informative. Kevin, you as usual, you were very good with your presentation and also your response to questions. What I particularly enjoyed today, though, is the input and the questions from the audience. They were very, very good. One of the things I like is Kevin worked with the data. You know, we keep clamoring for more data-driven policies and decision-making. So I was very happy to see Kevin work with a presentation with slides and so on. Right, key points that I'm just remembering off the top of my head: the economy declined by 19% in the last 7 years, and there is definitely a need for both better government and private sector policies to stimulate the economy, and we absolutely need to diversify away from oil and gas. So on that note, over to you, PRO Chris, so you can close off the session.
Well, this is just yet another great conversation that we were able to engage the audience in tonight. Interestingly, there were several things that were said tonight that stood out to me, where Mr. Ram-Narayan would have spoken about employment. And as an engineering student, that is something that I am very scared to face in the coming months when I would be graduating. So when he speak about persons that may have to move, that is a discussion that many students we have together. We discuss, well, on LinkedIn, where you have openings and graduate programs. And so it's a critical fear that young persons face at this time. What is also interesting is that the things that we are learning about green energy and diversification within the energy sector, and then we're not really seeing that practiced in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's a bit contradicting, but it was an interesting conversation, and I definitely think we need to have a part 2, because there was certain projections that would have been made by the Minister of Finance during the budget, and I think that is something that I would have liked to explore tonight, but of course we would have run out with some time. So I hope that, and I also see MP Paré, you were also here tonight. I think last night I engaged in another discussion, and so I'm very happy that he is able to be a part of this one and share his views with us. But really, truly, Mr. Kevin Ram-Narayan, we are really grateful for the knowledge that you were able to impart on us tonight, and the time
Thanks, Chris,
to put together the presentation. I noticed that there were many graphs involved, and I cannot imagine how long it would have taken you to put some of those graphs together with the data, because I just have to do a small scale of that, and it takes me quite some time. So thank you for the very interactive audience. We had a very interactive audience tonight. And I want to let everyone know that next week we will have just another great, exciting installment of Critical Conversations with the Campus. And we hope to see you there. There are some persons who would view this not in real time. So if you are still viewing this and we are not live, still leave a comment below. We still would like to know what you think, and we could probably discuss it next week. So for now, I'm Chris Hussein, and thank you for chatting with us. Good night.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone.